When a Japanese company buys oil from a country in the Middle East, the transaction is settled in US dollars, not Japanese yen, not the seller's currency, US dollars. Neither party is American. The oil never touches American soil, and yet the United States sits in the middle of that transaction by default. That is not a coincidence. It was designed. Here is something most people in developed economies take completely for granted. Their government can borrow money by issuing bonds denominated in its own currency. If the United States government needs money, it issues treasury bonds denominated in US dollars. It then pays back that debt in US dollars, dollars that the United States controls the supply of. This seems unremarkable until you compare it to every other country on Earth. When a developing country needs to borrow internationally, it typically borrows in US dollars, not its own currency, because lenders trust dollars more than they trust the local currency. This means that country must earn or acquire dollars, a currency it does not control and cannot print, to repay its debts. If the dollar strengthens against its local currency, its debt burden grows in real terms, even if it has not borrowed a single dollar more. This vulnerability, the gap between the country that controls the reserve currency and every country that must use it, is called dollar hegemony. And it is one of the most consequential and least discussed features of the global financial system. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how it was created, what extraordinary advantages it gives the United States, what it costs the rest of the world, and what the slow emergence of alternatives means for the system we all live inside. Let us start from the beginning. To understand how the dollar arrived at its current position, you need to go back to the summer of 1944. World War II was approaching its conclusion. The Allied nations gathered at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war international monetary system. The outcome of that conference became known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. At Bretton Woods, the Allied nations agreed that their currencies would be pegged to the US dollar at fixed exchange rates, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, convertible on demand for foreign governments. The logic was straightforward. The United States held the largest gold reserves in the world at that time, approximately 2/3 of global gold reserves. The U.S. economy had emerged from the war as the dominant industrial power, while European and Asian economies were devastated. The dollar was the most credible currency in the post-war world, making it the anchor of the international system reflected genuine economic reality. The Bretton Woods system worked for roughly 2.5 decades. And then came 1971, which we have covered in full detail in a previous video on this channel. As the United States spent heavily on both domestic programs and the Vietnam War, it printed more dollars than its gold reserves could back. Foreign governments began redeeming dollars for gold at an accelerating rate. President Nixon closed the gold window in August 1971, ending the convertibility of dollars to gold. The formal link between the dollar and gold was severed. But here is what was remarkable. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency anyway, not because of the gold link, but because of something that replaced it in the years immediately following 1971. An agreement between the United States and major oil-producing nations, particularly in the Gulf, that oil would be priced and sold exclusively in dollars. In exchange, the United States provided security guarantees and maintained a military presence in the region. This arrangement, the foundation of what became known as the petrodollar system, meant that any country in the world that needed to buy oil needed to hold dollars to do so. And since oil is the foundational energy source of industrial economies, every industrial economy needed dollars. The gold link was gone. The dollar's necessity remained, built not on convertibility anymore, but on the indispensability of oil and on the geopolitical arrangement that kept oil priced in dollars. Now let us talk about what reserve currency status actually gives the United States, because the advantages are extraordinary in ways that are rarely stated plainly in mainstream economic discussion. The first and most significant advantage is called the exorbitant privilege. This term was coined by a French finance minister in the 1960s, and it describes something specific. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the United States can run persistent trade deficits and fiscal deficits without facing the currency crises that would devastate any other economy doing the same. Here's why. When any country imports more than it exports, it must finance the difference somehow. Normally, persistent deficits lead to currency depreciation because the market loses confidence in an economy that consistently spends more than it earns. Currency depreciation makes imports more expensive, which naturally corrects the deficit over time. But the United States exports something that no other country does. It exports its currency. Foreign countries, institutions, and central banks need dollars to conduct international trade and to hold as reserves. This demand for dollars, created by the petrodollar system and by the general requirement to hold reserve currency, means the world continuously buys dollar-denominated assets, primarily U.S. Treasury bonds. This continuous foreign demand for U.S. Treasuries keeps U.S. interest rates lower than they would otherwise be and finances U.S. government deficit spending at favorable terms. The United States effectively charges the world a seigniorage, a profit from issuing the currency others must hold. The second advantage is sanctions power. Because international trade and finance runs primarily through dollar-denominated systems, and through banks that maintain dollar clearing relationships with American financial institutions, the United States has the ability to cut any country, company, or individual off from the global financial system by sanctioning them from the dollar clearing network. This is an extraordinary geopolitical tool available to no other country. A sanction does not require military action. It requires only the decision to exclude an entity from dollar access. And because the global financial system runs on dollars, that exclusion can be economically devastating. The third advantage is that the United States can borrow in its own currency at relatively low rates, and if it chooses, inflate the real value of that debt away, because it controls the supply of the currency in which the debt is denominated. No other country with significant foreign debt has this option. A country borrowing in dollars must earn or acquire dollars to repay. The United States only needs to issue more dollars, with all the distributional consequences of money supply expansion that we have covered in previous videos on this channel. These three advantages, the exorbitant privilege of running deficits without normal consequences, the geopolitical power of sanctions, and the ability to inflate away debt, represent an asymmetry of financial power between the United States and every other country on Earth. And every country on Earth is paying for it. If understanding the exorbitant privilege just changed how you think about why the United States can run deficits that would destroy other economies. Stay with me, because the advantages are only one side of this. The cost that dollar dominance imposes on the countries that must hold and use it, and what the slow emergence of alternatives means, that is what comes next. Here is what the rest of the world pays for the privilege of using someone else's currency as its own. Start with the most direct cost. Every country that holds dollars as reserves, and most do because they need them for international trade, is effectively lending money to the United States at low interest rates. They hold U.S. Treasury bonds as their primary reserve asset. Those bonds pay interest, but the real return on those bonds, adjusted for dollar inflation, is often modest or even negative. Over certain periods, the reserve holding country earns a low return on an asset that loses purchasing power as the U.S. expands its money supply, and it must hold those reserves anyway because without them it cannot participate in international trade. This is the hidden cost of dollar dependency. Second, dollar interest rate decisions made by the U.S. Federal Reserve for domestic American economic purposes have immediate and often severe consequences for developing economies that had no vote in those decisions. When the U.S. raises rates, dollar-denominated capital flows out of developing economies seeking higher returns in the United States. This capital flight can trigger currency crises. As the local currency falls against the dollar, dollar-denominated debt becomes more expensive to repay, potentially triggering a debt spiral. Multiple emerging market crises in the last several decades have followed this pattern, triggered or significantly worsened by Federal Reserve rate decisions made entirely for American domestic reasons. The countries affected had no voice in those decisions. Third, the petrodollar arrangement that sustains dollar dominance imposes a specific tax on every economy that imports oil. Every oil importing country must first acquire dollars, paying the transaction costs, exchange rate risks, and seigniorage of converting its own currency to dollars before it can purchase the energy its economy requires. This is a structural friction, cost imposed on the entire global economy by the dollar's mandatory role in energy markets, and the beneficiary of that friction cost is the country that issues the dollar, which collects the seigniorage, earns the float, and maintains the geopolitical leverage that comes from being at the center of the world's most critical commodity market. Understanding this does not require concluding that dollar dominance is purely exploitative. There are genuine benefits to having a stable, widely accepted reserve currency, lower transaction costs in international trade, and greater monetary stability than a fragmented multi-currency system might provide. But the distribution of benefits and costs across countries is not neutral. The issuing country captures most of the benefits, the using countries absorb most of the costs, and the countries with the least financial development and the most dollar-denominated debt bear the most severe exposure to the risks of a system they did not design and cannot exit. Here is the question that matters for your own financial life. What happens if dollar dominance gradually erodes? Because it is already eroding, slowly, unevenly, with significant resistance from the United States. But measurably, the share of global reserves held in dollars has declined from approximately 70% in the late 1990s to approximately 60% today. China and Russia have been conducting bilateral trade in their own currencies rather than dollars. Several countries have begun exploring gold-backed or commodity-backed settlement mechanisms that bypass the dollar entirely. The rise of digital currencies and payment systems that do not route through dollar clearing networks represents a long-term structural challenge to the dollar's indispensability. None of this means dollar collapse is imminent. The dollar's position is deeply entrenched in contracts, infrastructure, and institutional arrangements built over 8 decades. Displacement, if it comes, will be gradual, but the direction of the trend is documented and measurable. What does this mean practically? For an ordinary person, a gradual reduction in dollar dominance could mean upward pressure on U.S. interest rates as foreign demand for U.S. treasuries declines and the U.S. must offer higher yields to attract buyers. It could mean a period of dollar weakness and imported inflation as the natural correction mechanism that reserve status has been suppressing begins to operate. It could mean a gradual reduction in the geopolitical leverage the United States derives from sanctions power. Understanding this trajectory changes how you think about dollar-denominated cash holdings over long time horizons. It strengthens the case for holding productive assets rather than cash, for diversifying the currency exposure of savings where possible, for understanding that the monetary system you live inside is not permanent. It is a historical arrangement that has a beginning and will eventually have an evolution. Knowing that is not cause for panic. It is the accurate frame for long-term financial thinking. The dollar became the world's currency through a specific historical sequence of events. Bretton Woods, the gold window closing, the petrodollar arrangement that replaced it. Not through superior merit alone, through geopolitical architecture. That architecture gives the United States extraordinary advantages that the rest of the world finances. And it is slowly evolving, as all monetary architectures eventually do. Understanding the system you live inside, its origins, its mechanics, its trajectory, is not an academic exercise. It is the foundation of making financial decisions that account for the real world. Share this with one person who has ever heard the phrase reserve currency without fully understanding what it means. And if you want to keep understanding the monetary architecture shaping your financial life, subscribe to Hidden Truth Files. Hidden no more.